Then came the day that changed everything. The day of the kite fighting tournament, the day every child in Kabul dreamed of. The sky was colored with dozens of kites battling with their sharp strings, each trying to bring down the other. The air was charged with excitement, and the children's voices rose with laughter and cheers, while the adults watched from the rooftops. Amir knew that winning this competition could be the key to his father's heart, the proof that would finally make him see him as a hero worthy of admiration. And indeed, Amir succeeded in cutting the last kite, a moment of triumph before everyone. His heart filled with an overwhelming joy, a mixture of victory and the long wait for his father's approval. But the victory was not yet complete. The final torn kite, the true trophy of glory, had to be retrieved to prove the achievement to all. At this, Hassan darted off with his sincere, boyish smile running through the narrow alleys, carrying his excitement, unaware that his steps were leading him to a cruel confrontation that would leave an unhealable wound in his heart, and in his friend's heart as well. In a narrow alley, hidden from the eyes of the people, the unbearable happened. Hassan confronted a gang of cruel boys who had long persecuted him. When he refused to give up the kite he wanted for Amir, he paid a heavy price for his loyalty, a price an innocent child could not bear. He was subjected to a brutal humiliation that would remain a scar on his memory had he lived, and a deeper scar on the heart of Amir, who watched the scene, hiding behind a wall. That moment was a final test of loyalty, but Amir failed. He stood helpless, his body frozen, screams of fear and cowardice alternating within him with an overwhelming desire to flee. He did not extend a hand, he did not raise his voice, he did not defend his friend. He settled for silence. And his silence was crueler than a stab, more lethal than the betrayal itself. The kite fell from Hassan's hand, and with it fell what was left of the innocence in Amir's heart. From that moment on, he was never the same. Every glance from Hassan became a reminder of what he had done, and every smile from his lips an open wound reminding him of his betrayal. He had chosen silence. And his silence was not just a moment of weakness, but an unforgivable betrayal. A betrayal that would haunt him for the rest of his life and turn his childhood into a wound that would never heal. From that day, the day he abandoned his friend and chose silence over defense, the past became a long shadow from which he could not separate, following him everywhere and pursuing him at every moment. It was as if he were always walking with a sleepless eye at his back, an eye reminding him of what his hands had done and what they had refrained from doing. No matter how he tried to play or smile or forget, there was a faint voice inside him whispering, "You failed, Hassan." As the years passed, the change was not confined to his inner self. Change swept through his homeland as well. The Russian invaders entered Kabul, and the city that was once the stage of his childhood burned. The houses, gardens, and streets turned into desolate places shrouded in fear. He and his father, Baba, were forced to leave everything behind. The large house, the memories, and the land that no longer knew safety. The migration to America was like severing the cord that ties the body to its roots, but it did not sever the cord that ties the soul to the past. In America, everything changed. Baba, who had been a revered master in Kabul, became a humble worker at a gas station, toiling every day to maintain his pride in a foreign land. And Amir, who had belonged to a world of wealth and prestige, became an ordinary immigrant, living between two cultures. The culture of the past that besieged him and the image of the future he was trying to build. Yet he was the more fortunate one. He studied, wrote novels, and achieved a literary success that made him known in his new circle. He even married a beautiful Afghan girl who carried with her a piece of the homeland he had lost. But all these successes were fragile, like a thin crust hiding a deep wound beneath. He could not reconcile with himself, because his inner self remained a prisoner of that dark moment in the narrow alley in Kabul, the moment of his silence in the face of Hassan's tragedy. Whenever he wrote a novel or received applause from readers, he remembered that words do not erase a betrayal. And whenever he looked into his wife's eyes or sat beside his father, he saw another image within himself, the image of Hassan standing alone against his fate while he, the friend who should have protected him, remained hidden behind a wall. Amir had carried his entire homeland with him to America, not in his suitcase, but in the form of a guilt that never left him. He lived as if his life were a series of attempts to ignore that past, but he knew in his heart of hearts that the past is not something to be forgotten or erased. It is a wound that continues to bleed in silence, no matter how many years cover it. When the phone rang one distant day, its sound was not ordinary. It was like an old bell awakening within him everything he had tried to bury for years. On the other end, the voice of Rahim Khan, his father's old friend and his childhood companion, carried words that were short but heavier than mountains. There is a way to be good again. It was not a passing sentence, but a gateway opening to a past that had never settled, a wound that had never healed, and a guilt that had haunted him like an unshakable shadow. In that moment, Amir felt that these words were not just an invitation to return, but a summons for the soul to face its own mirror, an inescapable confrontation. He knew that the path to redemption would not pass through his books, nor through his successes in America, nor through his desperate attempts to forget the past, but through returning to the original wound, to the Kabul he had left behind as a terrified boy, and to which he now returned as a man bearing the weight of memory. When his feet touched the soil of his homeland, he discovered that the Kabul of his memory no longer existed. He did not find the city that had been adorned with gardens, birds, and kites. What he found was a disfigured city, its streets filled with rubble, its houses heavy with shattered memories, and its sky empty of colors. There were no longer wings for kites to fly in, but black flags hanging over every neighborhood, and the sound of bullets had replaced the laughter of children. Childhood had died in that land, buried under the rubble of war and destruction. In the midst of this painful return, a secret he had never expected was revealed to him. Hassan was not just his childhood friend or a loyal servant, but his half-brother, his father's son, who had carried a long-held secret and hidden it from everyone. This discovery was like another stab to his heart, increasing the weight of the guilt he had carried for so long. He had betrayed his brother, not just his friend, and left him to face his fate alone. But the tragedy did not stop there. He also learned that Hassan had been killed by the Taliban and had left behind a young son named Sohrab. The child carried in his dark eyes a profound sadness, a sadness not like that of children, but like an orphan shadow of the whole world, a shadow that reminded Amir of all he had lost and all he had wasted. Sohrab was not just Hassan's son. He was a symbol of the last chance for Amir, a chance to restore some of the lost justice and to seek his own salvation by saving the life of this little one. In a harsh confrontation with the past, Amir found himself face to face with his most terrifying nightmare, not in the form of a distant memory, but in the living flesh and blood of a man from the Taliban, the very same boy who had assaulted Hassan in their childhood, the tormentor who represented the fall of his innocence and the breaking of his silence. The confrontation was not merely a physical struggle, but a spiritual battle, a conflict between the old fear that had shackled him his whole life, and the desire for atonement that had driven him back to Kabul. Amir took the blows one after another, felt his ribs break and his body bleed. But amidst the pain, he felt something he had never known before, a sense of lightness, as if the blows tearing him apart physically were liberating him spiritually. The pain was a bridge, the blood an atonement, and the wound a path to redemption. At a great price, he managed to rescue Sohrab, the small child who was like a mirror of Hassan, a miniature version bearing his features but saturated with a sorrow deeper than his years. Amir carried him from the ruins of fear and brought him back across geographical borders to America, bringing with him a new refugee and a new promise. But he quickly realized that the hardest borders are not those that separate countries, but those that separate hearts. For orphans do not heal easily. And Sohrab was not just an orphan who had lost his parents. He was an orphan of tranquility, an orphan of trust in the world. He carried within him a wound larger than his age, a wound inherited from a father murdered by treachery and from a homeland that had crushed his childhood. Amir tried to build a bridge between himself and this child, but an inherited wound is crueler than a personal one, and the silence that veiled Sohrab's features was heavier than any scream. Amir's journey was not just an attempt to save a life, but an attempt to save a soul that had been extinguished too early. And yet, the story would not be complete without the return of the kite. On a spring day, Amir held a string in his hands and launched a kite into the sky, bringing back the colors that had long been absent from his memory, and raising a fragile piece of paper above all the burdens of the past. He looked at Sohrab, who was watching in silence, then ran after the kite just as Hassan had done in his childhood. And as he ran, he whispered words heavy with meaning, yet light in their delivery, "For you 1,000 times over." The phrase was not merely an echo from the past, nor an imitation of Hassan's voice. It was a postponed vow of forgiveness, a promise Amir made to himself, to his absent brother, and to his present child. Those words were a rebirth of the meaning of friendship, an acknowledgement that what was once broken could be mended, and that what was lost could be regained in another form. The phrase was a bridge between the past and the present, between betrayal and redemption, between the boy who betrayed his friend and the man who finally decided to run, not to escape, but to catch up with what he should have pursued long ago. And so, after the entire journey, after all the pain and betrayal, after all the absence and treachery, and after all the years of silence, a person stands to face himself, to face the indelible past, and finally understands that life is nothing but a series of choices, and that every choice carries its own weight, whether we feel it or not.